The coordinator would not look at me. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the flowers, not the music drifting through the venue doors, not the clusters of guests moving past me in their finest. I noticed that the young woman holding the seating clipboard had found something deeply interesting to study on the floor the moment I walked up and gave her my name. She said, "Yes, ma'am." And then she said, "If you'll just follow me." There was a pause after it. Small, but long enough for me to notice. "The seating chart was updated this morning," she added quietly. Then she turned before I could see her face complete the sentence. I followed her past the front section, past the second section, past the row where the grandmother of the groom was already seated with a corsage on her wrist and a glass of water in her hand. I followed her to a row of chairs positioned along the side wall near the service exit, where the catering staff moved in and out with quiet efficiency, and she gestured to a seat with a small placard that had my name on it and still would not meet my eyes. I sat down. I set my purse in my lap. I smoothed the front of my dress. My name is Clovey. I am 58 years old. I spent 30 years as a municipal administrator in this city. 30 years of budget hearings, council meetings, and rooms full of people who thought that if they spoke over you long enough, you would eventually stop knowing what you knew. I raised my daughter alone for 15 years. I ironed her graduation gown at 2 in the morning. I drove 4 hours through the night when the hospital called. I am the mother of the bride. And I had just been seated next to the kitchen. If you are watching this and you know exactly what kind of woman it takes to sit still in that moment, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are. I looked across the room. Tanya was already at the front. She was wearing ivory, not white, ivory, with the careful judgment of a woman who understood the distinction mattered. And she was working the room the way I had watched her work every room for 8 years. A touch on the arm here, a laugh timed perfectly there. The performance of a woman who had decided that presence was the same thing as belonging. She leaned toward the woman beside her. Her voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to that specific register a certain kind of woman uses when she wants the words to travel without her fingerprints on them. Her ugly, fat mama can go sit with the servers. A small laugh from Tanya, nothing from the woman beside her. I looked at Harvis. He was 4 feet from Tanya. He had heard it. I know he heard it because he turned. And for 1 full second, he looked directly at me across that room. 1 full second where he saw me sitting beside the service exit in the dress I had bought 3 months ago for this morning. Then he looked away, toward the door, like something outside had suddenly required his attention. I turned back to the front and sat with what I knew. I have been in this city for 30 years. Tanya has been here for 8. I have kept every document, every letter, every record that ever passed through my hands, including the divorce settlement I accepted 15 years ago without pushing back, because I was 43 and exhausted, and I needed it to be finished. That settlement is in a folder in the drawer of my nightstand. I did not move from that chair. I did not speak. I straightened my back, and I began to watch. Because in 30 years of sitting in rooms where people underestimated me, I had learned one thing with absolute certainty. The ones who seat you near the exit never consider that you might be the one watching the door. Sethi did not take her father's arm. That was the first thing I saw when the doors opened and the room rose. My daughter appeared at the back of that aisle in a dress that made my breath catch, and she was on Carvel's arm, her husband, the man she had chosen, not her father's arm, Carvel's. I watched Harvis process it from across the room. He was seated at the front, 2 chairs from the aisle, in the position that should have been earned. I could see the moment it registered, the slight shift in his jaw, the way his eyes moved from Sethi's face to her arm and back again. I watched him settle on an explanation. I could not hear his thoughts, but I have known that man for 23 years, and I did not need to. He told himself it was a modern choice, something the young people do now. He arranged his expression back into pride and held it there for the room. Sethi walked past him without looking. Reverend Dunmore opened the ceremony the way he opens everything, with the quiet authority of a man who has stood at the front of too many rooms to be impressed by the arrangements people make around him. He moved through the welcome, the scripture, the moment where he asked, "Who brought this woman?" And Carvel's family answered with the kind of warmth that fills a room from the floor up. I sat with my hands folded and watched my daughter become a wife. Tanya performed on schedule. The dabbed eye arrived during the vows, precise, visible, delivered at the exact moment the photographer was angled toward the family section. The hand found Harvis's arm twice. Once when Reverend Dunmore spoke about partnership. Once when Sethi and Carvel turned to face each other for the ring exchange. Each gesture landed for whoever was positioned to receive it. I recognized the timing. I had watched her workrooms for 8 years. Tanya understood that emotion, deployed correctly, was its own form of currency. I kept my face still. In 30 years of municipal work, I sat across from council members who moved budget lines and then looked directly at me while explaining why the numbers were correct. I learned early that the most useful thing a woman in my position could do was give them nothing to read. No reaction meant no information. No information meant they would eventually show me everything I needed to see on their own. Reverend Dunmore looked up during the vows. His eyes crossed the full length of that room and found my seat near the service exit. He held for exactly 1 moment. Not with pity, not with performance, with the particular steadiness of a man who sees what is in front of him and does not look away from it. I received it. Then I looked back at my daughter. That 1 moment was enough. The ceremony closed. Carvel kissed his bride. The room rose for the recessional, and the sound swelled, and I stood with everyone else, near the exit, beside the service corridor, and watched Sethi and Carvel come back down that aisle together. Sethi's face was full. The kind of full that has nothing performed in it. She did not look at Tanya. She did not look at Harvis. As the recessional moved past me, I began to scan the front section, the family rows, the reserved seats, and that was when I saw her, Dr. Charisse Fontaine, seated 3 chairs from the aisle near the front, in a chair that had clearly been placed and assigned before a single guest arrived this morning. I did not arrange that seating. I had not spoken to Dr. Fontaine in months, but my daughter had been planning this wedding for 14 months. And I was beginning to understand that some of what she had arranged had nothing to do with flowers. The toasts opened the way Sethi Petaway Cole planned everything, in sequence, without accident. Carvel's best man went first, then his mother. Then a college friend of Sethi's who told a story that made the room laugh and reach for their glasses. Each toast landed and passed, and the room settled back into itself, comfortable, warmed up, ready for whatever came next. When the microphone reached Sethi, the room quieted the way rooms do when the person holding the glass is the one everyone came for. She stood at the head table in her dress, her bouquet set down, her hands loose at her sides. She did not look at Tanya Simmons. She did not look at Harvis Simmons. She looked out across that reception hall, past the front tables, past the centerpieces, past every person positioned in the seats they had assumed they deserved. And she found me. I was still at the side section near the exit where I had been placed that morning. The room followed her gaze. I felt it before I saw it. The slow collective turn of 200 people finding the same point across the room, finding me. Sitting beside the service corridor in the dress I had bought 3 months ago, with my purse on my lap and my back straight, because I had not allowed it to curve once in the 6 hours I had been inside that venue. Sethi lifted the microphone slightly. I want to take a moment to honor the only parent who never had to be asked. Not once, not ever. She paused. Then she added, And before I do, I want to correct a change that was made to my seating plan this morning without my knowledge. The room went completely still. Not loud, still. The other kind. The kind where people stop moving before they understand why. Sethi never looked away from me. "Mama," she said, "come take your rightful seat." The silence lasted one full beat. Then another. I looked across the room. For the first time all day, Tanya Simmons was no longer smiling. Harvest Simmons had turned toward her. Neither of them moved. Then the applause started somewhere near the back and moved forward like water finding its level. And by the time I was on my feet, the whole room was standing. I walked. The full length of that reception hall, past the tables where Tanya's carefully cultivated acquaintances were on their feet with everyone else. Past the coordinator who had gestured me toward the exit that morning without meeting my eyes. Past every woman who had been close enough to hear what Tanya Simmons said and had chosen silence. I walked with my purse on my arm and my head level, and I did not rush, and I did not perform. The chair at the head table had been there since before the first guest arrived. I understood that now. Sethi had placed it herself. I sat down beside my daughter. The toast continued. Carvel's father spoke. An aunt on his side told a story about the first time Sethi came to Sunday dinner. The room moved forward the way receptions do, warm and unhurried, and the microphone passed from hand to hand. Harvest Simmons was not mentioned. Not in Sethi's toast. Not in the thank yous she gave at the close of the meal. Not in the acknowledgments printed in the program that had been on every seat when guests arrived. Not by name, not by relationship, not by implication. In the complete record of that reception, Harvest Simmons did not exist. He sat at his table and stared at the centerpiece in front of him. Tanya Simmons sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a very long time. I did not look at them. I watched my daughter dance with her husband, and I kept my face exactly as still as I had kept it all morning. Not because I felt nothing, but because what I felt was mine, and I had no intention of spending it in that room. It was Dr. Charisse Fontaine who leaned close just after the first dance ended. Her voice was low and even. "She told me what happened this morning," she said. A pause. "That's not all she told me." Sethi Petaway Cole arrived at my door at 9 in the morning with her hair wrapped and her wedding ring catching the light and a look on her face I recognized because I had worn it myself. The look of a woman who has been carrying something long enough that the weight has started to feel like posture. I made coffee. She sat at my kitchen table the way she has sat at that table her entire life, sideways in the chair, one leg tucked under her. And for a few minutes, we did not talk about anything that mattered. We talked about the food at the reception. We talked about Carvel's aunt, who danced until the venue staff started stacking chairs around her. Small talk that two women who love each other use to confirm the ground is still solid before they step onto it. Then Sethi set down her cup and looked at me. "I need to tell you some things," she said. "Not everything yet, but the first part." I nodded. I did not rush her. She told me about the college fund. Harvest Simmons had promised it when Sethi was 12. Not written down, not formalized, but promised. The kind of promise a man makes when he wants credit for a future he has no intention of building. He repeated it when she was 15, referenced it again when she was filling out applications at 17, sitting at this same kitchen table, the one I am sitting at now, while I helped her organize her essays, and neither of us mentioned that her father had not called in 6 weeks. When she got to college and needed it, she called him. He told her the markets had been difficult. Sethi did not argue. She did not cry on the phone with him. She thanked him for his time, ended the call, and spent the next 4 years applying for every scholarship she qualified for, working campus jobs, and accepting my help without once telling me what Harvest had said. I had assumed he was contributing. She had let me assume it because she knew what the truth would do to me. Before she sent Harvest Simmons a wedding invitation, before she had even chosen a venue, she decided she wanted an answer. Not a feeling, not a suspicion, an answer. Over several months, she reviewed public records, business filings, property disclosures, and every piece of information she could legally verify. She asked questions. She compared dates. She followed paper trails. What she found was not evidence of a fund that had performed poorly, not a fund that had been reduced, not a fund that had suffered losses. She found nothing, no indication that a college fund had ever existed at all. Harvest Simmons had simply made the promise and calculated correctly that she would never demand proof. She told me the rest of it then, not in anger, in the flat, precise tone of a woman reporting facts she has had years to organize. Harvest Simmons did not leave because the marriage failed. He did not leave because of Tanya Simmons. Not entirely. He left because Sethi's diagnosis at 6 years old had shown him a future he had not agreed to. A child who would need more than he had planned to give, who would cost more, require more, demand more of him than a healthy child would have. He had stayed 2 more years after the diagnosis. Then he had gone. Sethi was 8 when he left. She was 6 when the illness was named. She had done that arithmetic before she was 10 years old and had never once said it to me. I sat with that for a long moment. I did not cry. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had built a full and extraordinary life on top of everything she had been handed, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief, something quieter and more permanent than grief. Sethi watched me the way she always watches me when she is waiting to see if I am ready. "There's more," she said, "but I need you to be ready for it. And I need you to know that I've already taken steps." The house was quiet by 7. I had eaten, washed the dishes, and turned off the television because whatever was on it had nothing to do with what I needed to think about. I sat in the chair by the window, the one I have sat in for 15 years when something required my full attention, and I allowed myself the one reckoning I had refused every time it tried to surface. Not grief. I was done with grief. An inventory. I have conducted audits for 30 years, budget reviews, departmental assessments, procurement evaluations. The kind of work where emotion is not an asset, and accuracy is the only thing that matters. I know how to look at a set of facts without flinching, without editorializing, without allowing what I wished were true to interfere with what is. I applied that same standard to Tanya Simmons. She was introduced to our social circle through a woman named Deborah, a professional contact of Harvest Simmons who ran in the same commercial real estate adjacent world he occupied. That introduction happened at a dinner I did not attend because Sethi had a treatment appointment the following morning and I had stayed home to prepare. I have thought about that dinner exactly once before tonight. I am thinking about it now with different eyes. Tanya Simmons moved through rooms the way people move through them when they have studied the movement rather than grown up inside it. The vocabulary was curated, words that signaled education and taste without being specific enough to verify. The references she dropped in conversation were always slightly broader than the topic required, chosen for impression rather than precision. I recognized it because I had spent 30 years in rooms full of people, performing versions of themselves they had constructed rather than inherited. I could read the architecture of it within the first few exchanges. I had read Tanya Simmons the first time I met her. What I had not known then was that she had already been reading Harvest for months before that introduction was ever made. The remarriage came 14 months after our divorce was finalized. 14 months. I had spent those 14 months helping Sethi adjust to 2 households, managing her treatment schedule alone, and learning how to sleep in a house that was suddenly and permanently quiet on one side. Harvest Simmons had spent them building a second life that was already furnished before the first one was legally closed. I got up and went to the bedroom. The folder was in the nightstand drawer where it has been for 4 years. A standard manila folder, nothing dramatic about it, the kind I used to keep by the hundreds in my office. Inside it, correspondence from the divorce proceedings, financial disclosures Harvest submitted, asset declarations I accepted because my attorney was stretched thin and I was 43 years old and I had a sick child, and I needed it to be finished. I had looked at this folder the day I put it there, and twice since. Each time I had closed it because the moment had not been right. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The dates were what I had always known they were. An asset declaration dated March that did not align with a property record I had since pulled independently, showing a different valuation 11 months prior. A retirement account listed at a figure that did not match its documented balance from the previous year's statement, which I had kept because I keep everything. I suspected I was owed more than I accepted. The suspicion had been there for years. What I did not have then was the time, money, or evidence to pursue it. At 43, I was trying to keep a household running, manage Sethi's treatment schedule, and survive a divorce that had already consumed more energy than I could spare. My attorney had advised that challenging every discrepancy would require a level of litigation I was in no position to finance or endure. So I accepted the settlement, not because I believed every figure, because sometimes ending a fight is worth more than winning one. I closed the folder and moved on with my life. What sat in front of me now was different. Now there were documents, dates, records, questions that had answers attached to them. And for the first time, knowing something was wrong felt different from proving it. Near the back of the folder was a single page, a document from the settlement correspondence with a name on it I had never followed up on: Marcus Webb. I picked up my phone. It rang 3 times. A man I had not spoken to in 4 years picked up. Aunt Della came through my front door at noon with a covered dish, a plastic bag with 2 containers of something that smelled like it had been on the stove since morning, and the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for an invitation she was too dignified to request. I took the dish. She took off her coat. We moved around each other in my kitchen, the way women who have known each other their entire lives move, without instruction, without collision. She fixed her own plate and sat across from me at the table, and for a few minutes she talked about her neighbor's fence and a church matter that had apparently been unresolved since February. I let her talk. Della arrives at things in her own sequence, and there is no use trying to redirect her. She has always known exactly where she is going. She set her fork down and looked at me. "I watched you walk across that floor Saturday," she said. "I want you to know I had to hold on to that table." I nodded. "I've been holding some things," she said. "I held them because they were yours to deal with on your terms, and it wasn't my place. But I watched you walk across that floor, and something in me said, the time for holding is done." I folded my hands on the table and waited. Della described a dinner party. Nearly 10 years ago, 2 full years before Harvest Simmons and I signed a single divorce document. A gathering at the home of a couple we both knew, the kind of easy Saturday evening that fills itself with good food and comfortable conversation and people moving between rooms. Tanya Simmons had been there. She had been introduced as a professional contact of the host's husband, someone adjacent to the real estate world, present the way peripheral people are present at those kinds of evenings. Unremarkable on the surface. Della had watched her the entire night, not because she suspected anything, because Della has always been the kind of woman who watches rooms the way other people watch television, attentively, without announcing it, filing what she sees in some internal place that does not lose things. She watched Tanya Simmons move through that gathering with a precision that had nothing accidental in it. She watched her identify within the first 20 minutes which conversations were worth entering and which were not. She watched her calibrate: warmth for the women she needed to seem harmless to, deference for the men whose opinions would travel further than hers, and for Harvest Simmons specifically, something Della described as a very particular kind of attention that a woman only gives a man she has already decided on. Harvest had not noticed, or had chosen not to. Della had not said a word to me. Not that night, not in the months that followed, not when the marriage began its slow erosion, not when Harvest left, not in the 14 months between the departure and the remarriage. She had held it with the specific restraint of a woman who understood that certainty about someone else's marriage, spoken too early or without invitation, becomes interference rather than truth. She had simply kept it. Clean and undramatized, and exactly as she had witnessed it. I sat with everything she had just given me, and I understood that Tanya Simmons had not entered our lives through coincidence or chemistry, or any of the stories people tell themselves about how these things happen. She had entered with intention, 2 years before anyone acknowledged anything. 2 years before Harvest Simmons told me the marriage was over. Della picked her fork back up, then set it down again. "There's a man," she said. "He ran in Harvest's circle back then, but he knew Tanya before any of us did. Knew her well." She paused. "His name is Marcus Webb." I did not call Marcus Webb back directly. I had let the call from the previous night end after 2 sentences, enough to confirm he remembered who I was, enough to hear the particular quality of a man who picks up a phone after 4 years of silence and does not sound surprised. I told him I would be in touch, and I ended the call because I needed to think about how to approach what came next. I contacted Patricia Odom the following morning. Patricia spent 19 years working procurement contracts in the same commercial real estate adjacent world Harvest Simmons occupied. Not inside his circle, but close enough to know its geography. We had worked together briefly during a city vendor review 8 years ago and had kept the kind of quiet professional regard that does not require maintenance to remain intact. I asked her to pass a message to Marcus Webb, that I would appreciate a brief conversation, that I had no interest in causing trouble for anyone. Webb called me within 48 hours. His voice was measured. Careful in the way that people are careful when they are trying to determine how much the other person already knows before they decide what to offer. I recognized the register. I had heard it in budget hearings for 30 years. I told him I was not looking for a confrontation. I was looking for clarity on a small number of things. He said he understood and suggested we meet. I chose the coffee shop. Neutral ground, public space, nothing that could be characterized as anything other than 2 people having a conversation over coffee. Marcus Webb was a composed man. Somewhere in his early 60s, the kind of presentation that comes from decades of professional discipline. Nothing loud, nothing careless. He arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in, which told me he had thought about this meeting at least as carefully as I had. We ordered. We made 2 minutes of the kind of small talk that neither party is actually participating in. Then we both set it down. He did not confess. He confirmed. There is a difference. Confession carries guilt, and Marcus Webb did not present as a guilty man. He presented as a tired one. Tanya Simmons had come into his life 11 years ago through a professional introduction. He had been established in his field, well-connected, and, he said this without drama, available in the way that men who have worked hard for a long time and not paid attention to much else become available. The relationship had moved quickly. He had funded a business venture she proposed to front, a consulting firm, boutique positioning, the kind of operation that requires more social capital than financial investment to get off the ground. He had provided both. The connections Tanya Simmons carried into her eventual marriage with Harvest Simmons, the professional relationships, the social introductions, the access to rooms that suggested she had always belonged in them, had come through Marcus Webb's network. She had transferred them the way you transfer assets, cleanly, completely, and without acknowledgement of their origin. He had known this for years. He had said nothing. "Why?" I asked. He looked at his coffee cup. "Because saying something meant admitting what I had let happen," he said. "It was easier to be done with it." I nodded. I understood the arithmetic of that decision better than he knew. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table slightly, the body language of a man preparing to close a conversation. And he said the last thing. She didn't leave me. He kept his eyes on the table. I found out she'd been talking to Harvis for 8 months before she let me know we were done. Sethi called on a Thursday morning while I was still at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me. She did not open with small talk this time. She said, "Mama, I need to come over. There's something I should have shown you already, and I kept waiting for the right time. I think the right time is now." She arrived 40 minutes later with a manila envelope tucked under her arm and the same composed expression she had worn at the wedding. The one I now understood was not calm, but containment. There is a difference. Calm is the absence of pressure. Containment is what you build when the pressure has been there long enough that you have learned to hold it without showing the shape of it. She sat across from me and set the envelope on the table between us. When Sethi was 21, Harvis Simmons made an attempt at something. Not reconciliation, he was already married to Tanya Simmons by then. Not affection, exactly. A presentation of closeness that could be pointed to if anyone ever asked. He called Sethi and told her he was managing a property refinancing and needed help sorting old records before meeting with the lender. He said his assistant was out. He said she had always been sharp with numbers. He said most of it was only old statements, appraisals, closing documents, and property correspondence that needed to be arranged by year and address. He said it would only take an afternoon. Sethi said yes. She told me this without any particular emotion, the way you describe a Tuesday. She drove to his office. He had already pulled several boxes from storage and stacked them against the wall. Not current files, not anything he believed carried danger. Old paperwork. Old enough, apparently, for Harvis Simmons to assume it no longer mattered. That was his mistake. He had forgotten that old paper is still paper. Sethi spent 4 hours organizing the file structure he needed: statements, transaction records, correspondence sorted by date, and property address. She was thorough because she is always thorough. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, between a set of transaction records and a property appraisal dated 8 years prior, she found figures that did not belong to any refinancing, money that had moved during the period of our divorce settlement, asset transactions recorded at values that did not match what Harvis Simmons had declared when those same assets were disclosed to the court. Not a rounding error, not an accountant's correction, a pattern, specific, directional, and dated precisely within the window when the settlement terms were being finalized. Sethi did not react. She finished the filing. She straightened the folders the way I taught her to straighten folders. Edges aligned, labels facing the same direction. She accepted the lunch Harvis bought her at the restaurant downstairs. She thanked him for including her. She drove home. That evening, she wrote down everything she remembered: property names, transaction dates, valuation figures, account references, every detail that had caught her attention while she was sorting the records. She did not send any of it to me. Instead, over the following months, she quietly verified what could be verified: public property records, assessment histories, filing records, information available through legitimate channels to anyone patient enough to look for it. She held the results for 14 months. I looked at her across the table. Why 14 months? Because I needed the right person to read them, she said, and I needed to be certain before I handed them to anyone. She had found the accountant through a professional referral, someone connected to Dr. Charisse Fontaine's office network, the kind of quiet recommendation that moves between people who know what they are dealing with and who to trust with it. A forensic accountant. She had sat across from him the same way she was sitting across from me now and handed him the same envelope. His preliminary read had confirmed what Sethi already knew. I opened the envelope. I went through each page the way I have gone through documents for 30 years, slowly, in sequence, without skipping ahead. By the time I reached the last page, the coffee was fully cold, and neither of us had spoken in several minutes. I set the final page down and aligned it with the others. Sethi watched me the way she always watches me, waiting, patient, certain. "The accountant wants to meet you," she said. And Mama, she paused for exactly one beat. Dr. Fontaine asked me to tell you she's ready to talk whenever you are. Dr. Charisse Fontaine's office on a Saturday morning was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No staff at the front desk, no patients in the waiting area, just the particular stillness of a medical space emptied of its usual purpose. She had arranged it that way. She met me at the door herself and walked me back to her office and closed the door, and we sat across from each other the way two women sit when they both understand that what is about to be said will not be easy to hear and will not be softened. She had a folder on her desk. She did not open it. I've known Sethi since she was 11 years old, she said. I want you to understand that what I'm going to tell you today I have wanted to say for a very long time. Dr. Charisse Fontaine had been managing Sethi Petaway Cole's care across 15 years of appointments, treatment adjustments, crisis interventions, and one hospitalization. She had records I had never seen, not because I was excluded, but because Sethi, from the age of majority onward, had managed her own medical life with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else. Fontaine told me about the appointments. In 15 years, Harvest Simmons attended one. Sethi was 13. He sat in the chair beside the examination table and spent the majority of the appointment looking at his phone. He asked no questions. When Fontaine addressed him directly, he looked up, nodded, and looked back down. He did not come again. By the time Sethi was 16, she had stopped mentioning him in appointments entirely. Not with bitterness, Fontaine said, but with the particular finality of a child who has finished waiting for something and moved on without announcing the decision. Then Fontaine told me about the night I already knew from my own side and had never heard from anyone else's. Sethi's first semester of college. A vaso-occlusive crisis, the kind that does not announce itself gradually but arrives without negotiation. Pain that the admitting notes recorded as severe, oxygen assistance required. IV pain management. A 19-year-old alone in an emergency room 4 hours from home because she had not wanted to frighten me until the staff called me first. The hospital had Harvest Simmons listed as emergency contact on intake forms Sethi had completed at 17. Standard protocol required notification. They called him. He told the nurse on duty that he would make arrangements and call back. He did not call back. I drove 4 hours through the night. I know what I found when I walked into that room at 2 a.m, my daughter on oxygen, an IV in her arm, a nursing student sitting in the chair beside her bed because Sethi had asked her not to leave. I know what Sethi's face did when she saw me come through that door. What I had not known, until this morning, was that Harvest Simmons called Sethi's cell phone the following afternoon. She did not answer. Before she was discharged, she asked a nurse for a new set of intake forms. She updated her emergency contact. She removed Harvest Simmons's name and replaced it with mine, which is where it should have been from the beginning. And she did not tell him she had done it. She simply made him disappear from the one document where his presence had ever been required to mean something. Fontaine sat with me in the silence that followed. She did not try to fill it. She understood that some information requires space around it before it can be fully received. Then she said, Sethi asked me to be at the wedding because she wanted someone in that room who had watched all of it from the beginning. She wanted a witness. A pause. I think she wanted you to have one too. I opened it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a fresh cup of coffee and the particular quality of attention I used to bring to departmental audits. The kind that does not look for what it expects to find, but simply looks. The folder had been in my nightstand for 4 years. I had opened it twice in that time and closed it both times because I was not ready. Not emotionally, but strategically. There is a difference. Emotion tells you that something is wrong. Strategy tells you when the moment is right to do something about it. Those two things rarely arrive together, and I had learned a long time ago not to move until they did. They had arrived. I went through each document in sequence. Correspondence from the divorce proceedings first, letters between attorneys, requests for disclosure, the standard paper trail of a marriage being formally unwound. I had read all of it before. I read it again now, with 15 additional years of administrative experience and the forensic accountant's preliminary findings sitting in a separate envelope beside my coffee cup. The financial disclosures came next. Harvis Simmons had submitted asset declarations across 3 separate filings during the settlement period. I had accepted them because my attorney at the time was managing 14 active cases, and I was 43 years old with a sick child and a household to reorganize, and I needed the process to end. I had accepted the figures the way exhausted people accept figures, because the alternative was more time, more cost, more of my attention spent on a man I was trying to move away from. I looked at those figures now without exhaustion, without any feeling at all, in fact, except the clean, focused attention of a woman reading a document that was designed to be accepted without scrutiny. The asset declarations did not hold. A property on record with the county assessor's office showed a valuation in the year prior to settlement that was 31% higher than the figure Harvis declared. I had pulled that assessor record myself 8 months after the divorce was finalized, filed it in the folder, and said nothing. A retirement account disclosure listed a balance that was inconsistent with the account's own statement from 11 months earlier. A statement I had, because joint financial documents from an intact marriage do not disappear cleanly the moment a separation begins. I had kept it. I keep everything. I suspected I was owed more than I accepted. What I had not had 4 years ago was Sethi's screenshots, a forensic accountant's preliminary confirmation, and the particular clarity that comes from sitting in a room where your daughter has already done the hard work of verification and handed you the results. The question was no longer whether something looked wrong. The question was whether there was still something I could do about it. I picked up the phone and called the family attorney. Her name was Renata Oglesby, and she had handled my estate planning for 11 years and knew exactly how I operated. I told her I had documents from my divorce settlement I needed her to evaluate. I told her I was not calling to file anything. I was calling to ask one question, whether what I was looking at was serious enough to revisit after all this time. She asked me to describe what I had. I described it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me to photograph 3 specific documents and send them to her encrypted client portal immediately. I sent them. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Renata Oglesby's voice was measured and precise and carried the particular weight of an attorney who has just read something that changed the shape of what she thought she was dealing with. "Clovey," she said. "When exactly did you first notice these discrepancies?" I told her. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Good. Send me everything." A pause. "If these dates are what they appear to be," he didn't underreport by a little. The email arrived on a Tuesday evening while I was at the kitchen table going through the documents Renata Oglesby had returned to me with her annotations in the margins. The sender was Marcus Webb. The subject line said only, "Thought you should have this." I set down Renata's documents and read his message first. It was brief, 4 sentences, no preamble. The week after we met at the coffee shop, he had lunch with a former colleague, a man who moved in the same commercial real estate circles Harvis Simmons occupied. The colleague mentioned, without any awareness of the connection to me or to anything Marcus Webb and I had discussed, that Harvis and Tanya Simmons were currently in the process of refinancing 2 properties. Marcus Webb had sat with that information across a lunch table and understood exactly what it meant alongside everything else he knew. He had gone home and pulled the documentation he had kept for years, in the same way I keep things, not out of sentimentality, not out of intention to use it, but out of the particular discipline of a man who spent decades in professional environments, where paper was the only thing that ever told the full truth. He had scanned it and sent it to me that evening. I opened the attachment. What Marcus Webb sent was not dramatic. It was thorough. There were business records from the consulting firm Tanya had operated during the period they were together. Correspondence showing how she gained access to professional contacts through his network. Records showing which introductions originated with Marcus Webb, which opportunities followed those introductions, and how those same relationships appeared later in Tanya Simmons's professional life, with no visible reference to where they had begun. None of it proved a crime. What it proved was a pattern of entering a situation, extracting value from it, and moving forward without acknowledging where that value came from. I sat with the documents spread across my table and compared them to information already sitting in Sethi's accountant's preliminary review. Names appeared in both places. Property references appeared in both places. Business entities appeared in both places. Not enough to establish conclusions by themselves, but enough to create questions. Important questions. Questions that become very difficult to avoid when banks, attorneys, accountants, and lenders begin reviewing financial histories during a refinancing process. That was what caught my attention, not Tanya's past. The timing. Refinancing requires scrutiny, applications, supporting documentation, verification, people comparing old records to new records and asking whether the numbers align. Most transactions pass through that process without difficulty because the underlying records tell the same story every time they are examined. Problems begin when different records tell different stories. Whether Harvest Simmons knew any of this was impossible for me to determine. What I could determine was something simpler. For 8 years, Harvest Simmons had presented Tanya Simmons as the woman who helped elevate his life. The polished partner who belonged effortlessly in every room, every conversation, every professional circle they entered together. The documents Marcus Webb sent suggested a different possibility. Some of the opportunities, relationships, and advantages Tanya carried into that marriage had not originated with Harvest at all. They had come from the life she built before him, from people who had opened doors for her long before she ever met my ex-husband. There is nothing wrong with that. What caught my attention was how carefully those origins seemed to disappear from the story afterward. I read the last page twice. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the kitchen ceiling. For years, I had assumed Tanya Simmons was exactly what she appeared to be: ambitious, polished, socially skilled, and very good at positioning herself in the center of any room she entered. The documents did not contradict that. If anything, they confirmed it. What they added was context. Context that Harvest Simmons may never have examined closely. Context that becomes harder to ignore when outside professionals begin comparing records that were never expected to be viewed side by side. The refinancing Webb's colleague had mentioned was not important because of the properties. It was important because scrutiny was coming. And scrutiny has a way of finding things people never expected anyone to look for. I closed the folder and set it beside Renata's documents. For the first time since the wedding, I found myself wondering less about Tanya Simmons and more about Harvest. Because if even half of what I was reading was new information to him, then the next surprise in that household was not going to belong to me. It was going to belong to him. My phone rang at 7:43 on a Wednesday evening, and Harvest Simmons's name appeared on the screen for the first time since the wedding. I let it ring twice. Not because I was uncertain about answering. I had been expecting this call for several days, but because I wanted to receive it standing still rather than in the middle of reaching for something. I set down what I was holding, stood at the kitchen counter, and picked up. Clovey. His voice was easy, warm almost. The specific warmth of a man who has rehearsed an opening and landed on casual as the register least likely to reveal that he rehearsed it. "How are you doing?" "I'm well, Harvest," I said. "Thank you for calling." I gave him that and nothing else. No questions back. No filling of the space his greeting left open. I have sat across from enough people who needed something from me to know that silence, offered pleasantly, is the fastest way to find out what they came for. He told me Sethi had looked beautiful. I agreed that she had. He said it was a lovely event, that Carvel's family had been warm, that the venue was beautifully arranged. I said yes to all of it in the tone of a woman having a perfectly comfortable conversation. He said he hoped that whatever tensions existed could be set aside in a spirit of goodwill. For Sethi's sake, for the family's sake, moving forward. I told him I thought that was a reasonable hope. He did not mention the seat. He did not mention what Tanya Simmons had said in that venue. The words I had heard from 20 feet away with complete clarity. He did not mention Tanya Simmons at all. In 7 minutes of conversation, her name did not appear once, which told me exactly how the Simmons household had processed the wedding and exactly what each of them understood about the situation they were now navigating. He circled near the divorce proceedings twice. The first time it came wrapped in something about financial planning, a general comment about how these things had a way of becoming complicated over time, and how he had always believed in handling matters cleanly. I said I appreciated that perspective. The second time he came slightly closer, something about hoping there were no lingering misunderstandings from the original settlement, that his intention had always been to be fair. I told him I had no complaints about the process. I watched him try the handle twice and told him twice, in the most pleasant voice I possess, that the door was exactly where he had left it. When the call ended, I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment and reviewed what I had gathered. Something had reached him. Not facts, not documents, not anything specific enough to name, but enough. Enough to make a man who had spent 15 years treating the divorce as settled suddenly interested in discussing fairness. Enough to make him call. Enough to make him start testing the edges of conversations he had avoided for more than a decade. That told me there was a conversation happening inside the Simmons household that was not yet complete. I picked up my phone and typed 2 words to Sethi Petaway Cole. He called. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. When I turned back, the screen was lit. Sethi's response had come back in under a minute. I know. It's ready. I stood with those 4 words for a long moment. Not with surprise, with the particular feeling that arrives when you understand that the person you raised has been operating several steps ahead of the current moment for longer than you realized, and that she had said nothing because she had not needed to. She had simply been ready. Renata Oglesby sent the letter on a Thursday morning. I knew the exact time it left her office because she sent me a message through the client portal at 9:17 that said simply, "Sent, tracked. Addressed to Harvest Simmons at the residential address you provided." I read it at my kitchen table, closed the portal, and went about the rest of my morning the way I go about mornings, methodically, without rushing anything that did not require rushing. The letter was not a lawsuit. Renata had been precise about that distinction, and I had agreed with her reasoning. A letter of inquiry was the correct first move, formal enough to require a response, specific enough in its references to the settlement documentation that anyone reading it would understand immediately that the person who sent it had done their homework. It named 3 financial records by date and description. It requested clarification on the discrepancy between declared asset valuations and independently documented figures. It gave Harvest Simmons 30 days to respond through counsel. 30 days was a courtesy. We both understood he would not take 30 days. Aunt Della called at 2:30 that afternoon. She did not open with the information. Della never opens with the information. She arrives at it through the side door, the way she arrives at everything. She asked how I was feeling, mentioned that her neighbor Beverly had stopped by that morning, mentioned that Beverly lived 2 streets over from the Simmons house and walked that route every day because her doctor had told her to get her steps in. I waited. Beverly had passed the Simmons house shortly after 11. Tanya Simmons had come outside carrying a large envelope. Beverly recognized it because she had seen the courier vehicle parked on the street earlier that morning. Tanya had already opened it. What caught Beverly's attention was not the envelope. It was Tanya. Beverly described it the way observant women describe things they witnessed without fully understanding. She said Tanya's shoulders did something, that she went very still for a moment, that she stood beside the mailbox reading the same page twice. Then she folded the documents back into the envelope and walked toward the house, without collecting the rest of the mail. 3 envelopes remained in the box. The front door closed behind her. I thanked Della. I told her Beverly had good eyes. Della said Beverly had always had good eyes, and that was why she had been telling me for years that Beverly would make an excellent neighbor. I made a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and considered what I knew. Tanya Simmons had seen Renata's letter before Harvest Simmons returned home. That meant whatever conversation was about to happen inside the Simmons household that evening would begin with Tanya's version of what the letter said, her framing, her characterization, her particular management of information after several hours alone with it. Harvest would receive the facts second. He would receive them already interpreted. Renata had told me the letter would generate a response quickly, not because of the tone, because of the documents it referenced. I drank my coffee. I read through 2 chapters of a book I had been trying to finish for 3 weeks. I washed my cup, dried it, and put it away. At 8:51 that evening, my phone rang. Harvest Simmons. I answered on the second ring. The voice that came through was not the voice from the previous call, not the managed warmth, not the rehearsed ease of a man who had decided casual was his safest register. This voice was tighter, pressured in the way a man's voice gets when a question he thought was settled suddenly returns with paperwork attached. He said, "Clovey, I need to understand what is happening." I looked out the kitchen window. Then I sat down. The letter had done exactly what it was sent to do. It had moved the conversation from assumptions to documents, and documents are much harder to argue with. The first call came from a woman named Gloria Treadwell. Gloria had worked alongside me in the city's budget division for 11 years before she transferred to a different department, and we settled into the quieter rhythm of women who see each other at church and remember each other's birthdays. She called on a Monday morning and said, without preamble, "I want you to know that Tanya Simmons called me last week. I thought you should hear that from me directly." I thanked her. I asked her what was said. Gloria described it the way precise women describe things they found distasteful, but handled correctly, with accuracy and without embellishment. Tanya had called with the warmth of a woman making a friendly check-in and had arrived, within 4 minutes, at a characterization of Clovey Petaway as a woman struggling to move forward. Bitter was the word Gloria believed was used, though positioned carefully enough that it could be walked back if necessary. Unable to accept that a chapter had closed, making legal trouble now that her daughter was settled and she had nothing left to occupy herself with. Gloria had listened politely and ended the call and picked up the phone to call me. The second call came 2 days later from Marcine Hollis, a woman I had known since we were both young mothers navigating the same school district, the same pediatricians, the same particular exhaustion of raising children in a city that did not always make it easy. Marcine's account of her conversation with Tanya Simmons matched Gloria's with the specificity of a script being delivered consistently. The same framing, the same sympathetic tone, the same careful positioning of Tanya as the reasonable party caught between a difficult situation and a woman who could not let go. I listened to Marcine the same way I had listened to Gloria. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her calling. I did not explain anything. I did not offer a counter-narrative or ask either woman to take my side in something I had not invited them into. I had spent 30 years building relationships in this city by being exactly who I was in every room I entered. No performance, no management, no gap between the woman people saw at a budget hearing and the woman they saw at a Saturday morning church auxiliary meeting. That consistency was not a strategy. It was simply how I had lived. but it had consequences that Tanya Simmons had not calculated. The women she was calling had known me since before she knew Harvest Simmons existed. They had watched me manage a municipal department through 2 administrations and a budget crisis. They had watched me raise Sethi alone, without making it anyone else's burden. They had sat beside me in rooms where I had every reason to be angry, and had watched me be precise instead. Tanya's narrative required them to set aside 20 and 30 years of direct evidence and accept 8 years of curated proximity in its place. The narrative did not travel. It stopped at the first door it reached, and then the second, and then the women behind those doors picked up their phones and called me instead. I noted all of it. I noted the consistency of the script, the same words, the same sequence, the practiced delivery of a woman who had done this before in smaller rooms with smaller stakes and had not yet encountered a community that had been paying attention longer than she had been present. I was at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, going through Renata Oglesby's latest correspondence, when my phone rang. Sethi Petaway Cole. Her voice was steady. Sethi's voice is always steady, but it was carrying something large underneath the steadiness, the way deep water carries current that the surface does not show. "Mama," she said, "the accountant finished the full assessment. It's more than we thought. I need to come over." The resolution did not arrive the way resolutions arrive in stories. There was no single moment. No room where I sat across from Harvest Simmons and watched his face confirm everything I already knew. No confrontation scene with the right words landing at the right time in front of the right people. That is not how consequences work in real life. Not the lasting kind. Not the kind that cannot be undone or reframed or managed into a different shape. The lasting kind arrive quietly, in sequence, the way water moves through a structure that was never as solid as it appeared. Renata Oglesby filed the formal inquiry 3 weeks after the letter. Harvest Simmons's attorney contacted her office shortly afterward. Not to contest, to negotiate. The process moved slower than television teaches people to expect. Documents were exchanged, financial records were reviewed, questions were answered, additional questions followed. Months passed the way legal and financial matters usually pass. One request, one response, one review at a time. I went to work. I attended church. I had breakfast with Sethi. Life continued while attorneys did what attorneys do. What emerged several months later was a settlement. The difference between what I had accepted in exhaustion 15 years ago and what the documentation showed I was actually owed, calculated with interest across the intervening period. It was not a small difference. Renata called me on a Tuesday afternoon and read me the figure, and I sat at my kitchen table and received it the way I receive most things, quietly, without performance, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been doing the internal accounting for a long time and was finally seeing the external ledger corrected. It did not go to trial. There was no public spectacle, no hearing crowded with spectators, no dramatic testimony. Harvest Simmons signed without a statement, and his attorney requested confidentiality as a condition, which Renata accepted because I had not come for his reputation. I had come for what was mine. Tanya Simmons's history did not become gossip. It became something quieter and more permanent than gossip. In the months following our meeting, Marcus Webb spoke to people who had known him professionally for years. Information that had been sitting unnoticed inside old records and forgotten paperwork began surfacing in ordinary business reviews and financial examinations. Nothing explosive, nothing theatrical, just scrutiny. The kind that arrives when people start asking routine questions and expecting complete answers. Tanya Simmons's professional positioning in this city began to develop the particular instability of a structure whose load-bearing walls turn out to be borrowed, not collapsed, not destroyed, simply no longer able to hold the weight she had placed on them without the support she had built them on. Harvest Simmons did not call again. I did not expect him to. A man who had spent much of his life making calculations had made the final one. that there was nothing left in this direction that served him, and had moved accordingly. He was left with a marriage he had never fully examined, a settlement he could not revisit, and whatever he was now beginning to understand about the woman he had chosen to build his second life with. That was not my accounting to do. Mine was done. The folder sat closed on my kitchen table on a Sunday morning in early spring. I had taken it out of the nightstand the night before and set it there, not to open it, just to look at it in the light. 4 years of careful keeping, every date, every document, every record I had held until the moment was right. I left it on the table and went to bed, and slept the way I had not slept in a very long time. In the morning, Sethi called to say she was coming for breakfast. I put on the coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the yard coming back after winter, and I let the quiet be what it was. I didn't burn anything down. I just stopped putting out fires that were never mine to manage. And when I stepped back, everything that was built on smoke finally showed what it was.